A day of evil omen for the Greek people is the 29th of May. For it was on the 29th of May, 1453, that the city of Constantinople fell to the Turks. The great Church of the Holy Wisdom, symbol of the unity of the Orthodox world, ceased to be a place of Christian worship and became a mosque. Today it's not even a mosque, it's just a museum. Constantinople had been quite weak politically for some time. The Byzantine Empire never recovered from the sack of the city in 1204. The restored empire from 1261 onwards was very much smaller than the empire in its palmy days of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. And it grew steadily smaller and smaller during the last 2 centuries as the Ottoman Turks advanced. What is surprising is not that Constantinople fell eventually to the Turks. What is surprising is that it survived for so long. And those last 2 centuries were a time of political and economic weakness, but paradoxically, they were also a time of a rich and creative spiritual life. In the 14th century, there was a movement known as hesychasm, a tradition of inner prayer and mystical theology, which came to full flowering in the figure of St. Gregory Palamas, Archbishop of Thessalonica. And as well as being a period of great spiritual dynamism, it was also a time of great artistic achievements. Some of the most beautiful monuments of the Byzantine era, such as the Church of the Chora, known also by its name when it became a mosque under the Turks, Carrie Jami. That is probably the high point in Byzantine art. So outward weakness went hand in hand with inner strength. But in the end, Constantinople succumbed. At the same time, in the 15th century, the Turks took over the Balkan Peninsula, so what is now Greece and Macedonia, Serbia, Bulgaria, all of these areas became part of the Turkish Empire. So also did what we now know as Romania, but at that time it was known as the Principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia. though the Christians in Moldavia and Wallachia enjoyed a greater freedom than the Christians elsewhere in the Turkish Empire. For example, they were allowed to ring bells in their churches, which Christians elsewhere under Islam were not permitted to do. This meant that from the mid-15th century, the only major Orthodox church that was free from Islamic domination was the Church of Russia, with its two major centers, Kiev, in what is now regarded as Ukraine, and further north, Moscow. Shortly before the fall of Constantinople, the Church of Moscow asserted its independence from the Patriarchate of Constantinople, but Kiev remained under the Church in Constantinople until towards the end of the 17th century, when it was incorporated in Moscow. There grew up in the Muscovite Church the idea of Moscow the Third Rome. The theory ran much as follows. The first Rome, on the banks of the Tiber, had fallen to the barbarians and had later lapsed into what the Byzantines thought was schism and heresy. The second Rome, in the view of the Russians, had also fallen into schism when it had accepted, albeit only temporarily, the Union of Florence. So it too had lapsed into schism, and it too had fallen to the barbarians. So the visible centre of Christendom, the theory went, had moved north from Constantinople to Moscow, which was the Third Rome, the chief Christian centre in the Orthodox world. Two Romes have fallen, so the theory went, but a third stands firm, and a fourth there shall not be. In due course, the Church of Russia became a patriarchate in 1589. But according to the theory of the Third Rome, it should have ranked first, but it never ranked higher in the Orthodox hierarchical order than fifth. The four ancient patriarchates, though greatly diminished in size, though subject to Turkish domination, remained in the first place. Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. And Russia, though recognized as a patriarchate, only came fifth. But it certainly inherited the leadership in the Orthodox world. Let's reflect a little on the situation of the Greeks under Turkish Islamic rule. We can now distinguish a fourth period in Orthodox Church history, so far as the Eastern Mediterranean is concerned. You may remember we have the early church up to Constantine's conversion, 312. We have the first Byzantine period, the era of the 7 ecumenical councils, from 312 to the definitive restoration of icons in 843. Then you have the later Byzantine period, 843 to the fall of the city in 1453. Now then we enter the Ottoman period, the time of Turkish rule. Indeed, much of the Greek Orthodox world in the Near East had been under Islamic domination for centuries before Constantinople actually fell. But we can date the Ottoman period in a firm way from the end of the Byzantine Empire, 1453, up until, let us say, the First World War. And from 1918 onwards, we enter into the modern Orthodox period. What then was the general situation of the Greek Church under Turkish rule? They enjoyed toleration. According to Islamic law, if Christians and others resist the advance of the true believers, the Muslims, then they are to be put to the sword and massacred. But if they accept in a quiet and peaceful way Muslim rule, then they are not to be exterminated nor forcibly converted. They may continue to practice their faith, to keep their churches open, as long as they continue quietly subject to the Turkish overlordship. Now, Islam is a theocracy, that is to say, it does not recognize any clear distinction between religious and secular power. The Sultan in the Ottoman period was not only the civil head of state, but also the religious head. Under the Islamic system, if Christians were to be recognized, then they had to be, as it were, a state within the state. The Patriarch of Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarch, was acknowledged by the Ottomans as head of the Orthodox Christian Church, but that meant he was also to be considered the civil head of the Greek nation. He became the ethnarch. In a curious way, the power of the ecumenical patriarchate expanded as never before under the Ottomans. There was no longer a Christian emperor wielding supreme civil power and having very considerable control over the church. The patriarch now combined together both religious and civil authority. What is more, in the other areas where there had been independent Orthodox churches, such as Bulgaria and Serbia, these were suppressed as the Ottoman dominions expanded, and they were placed under the Patriarch of Constantinople. So his spiritual territory extended as never before. And he and the bishops were also responsible for the internal life of the Greek people and of the other Slav Christians and Romanian Christians who came within the Ottoman Empire. So the Patriarch and his bishops would have been responsible, for example, for marriage law and for dealing with inheritance, for dealing with all civil cases which involved only the Christians, and even criminal cases involving only the Christians. So the Church enjoyed, under the Turks, a wide liberty. In Islamic law, Jews and Christians are people of the book. They share with Islam respect for the Old Testament. And therefore, from the Mohammedan point of view, the Christian faith is not entirely false, though it is incomplete. The Muslims honor Jesus as a prophet, but not as incarnate Son of God. They also honor the Blessed Virgin Mary, and they accept the virgin birth of Christ. Toleration, yes, but the Christians were very definitely second-class citizens. They had to pay much heavier taxes than the Muslims. They could not serve in the army, but they were used by the Turks in diplomatic relations with the Western powers. And the Muslims would very often have Christian doctors to look after them. But the restrictions on the Christians went further than simply paying heavier taxes. For example, there was a levy of Christian children. The Islamic authorities would go round to the Christian towns and villages, and wherever they found boys who seemed healthy and intelligent, they were forcibly taken away from their parents, brought up as Muslims, made to forget their Christian inheritance, obliged to serve in the Turkish Janissary Guard, the special guard that surrounded the Sultan. This child levy continued into the 17th century, and as you may imagine, it caused great distress to the Christians. And in many other ways, the Christians were subject to constant harassment, humiliation, and they were plundered again and again by the Ottoman overlords. Toleration, yes, but the Christians were very definitely second-class citizens in the Turkish Empire. Now, the Ottoman period in Orthodox history, as I was saying, from the 15th to the early 20th century, is in many ways a time of decline, of stagnation in the Orthodox world. There was little creative development of Orthodox theology, though some things did happen, as I shall mention in a moment. It was also a time of internal corruption. The Turkish authorities demanded a heavy money payment from each new patriarch of Constantinople when he was installed in office. The patriarch had to recover his money from the bishops, who had to pay to the patriarch and to the Turkish state when they were installed in their dioceses. and the bishops in due course would recover the money from their flock. And the parish priests would demand payment for every small act of Christian service. Every time they celebrated a memorial service for the dead, or visited cemeteries, or went to bless homes, their hand would be extended. A little money, please. So, in a way, in the Greek church under the Turks, everything was up for sale. And this system of corruption undoubtedly had a demoralizing effect on the church. It was in the interests of the Turkish authorities to change the patriarchs as often as possible, because this gave them increased opportunities for demanding money. In the 17th century, the average length of time that a patriarch remained in office was 18 months. You can imagine the effect this had on the stability of the church. The bishops in the Holy Synod, who ruled the church along with the patriarch in Constantinople, were divided into different parties, each with their own candidate for patriarchate. And they tore each other's vitals out in mutual disputes. Western visitors to the Orthodox Church commented with sorrow on the melancholy effects of this system of corruption and division. Not a brilliant period, but there is another side to the story. At any rate, in the Greek world, the vast majority of Christians remained faithful to their inherited belief. In worldly terms, they had every advantage in apostatizing and becoming Muslims. They'd pay less taxes. They would enjoy other privileges. And undoubtedly, very many of the Christians fell away. But while that happened extensively in Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey, in the Greek world, the great majority of the population, poor and oppressed as they were, held fast to faith in Christ. So the Ottoman period can be considered a time of decline, but also a time of heroism. All through the Ottoman period, there were occasions when Christians were put to death. We have a special class whom we call the new martyrs, by which we mean those who died for their faith. In many cases they were Christians who, in a moment of weakness, perhaps when they were drunk, perhaps because they wanted to marry a Turkish woman, renounced their Christian faith and then repented. And any convert to Islam who then wished to revert to Christianity faced inevitably the death penalty. So we have a whole series of martyrs for the faith. Most of them not bishops or highly educated persons, but simple artisans, tailors, builders, fishermen. It was from this class that most of the new martyrs came. So there is a side of spiritual beauty in the Turkish period, as well as one of decline. Orthodox theology during the Turkish period underwent two tendencies. First of all, there was an extreme conservatism. The Orthodox, under Muslim rule, felt themselves on the defensive, and their basic policy was, let us just hang on to what we have. So, yes, the traditional Orthodox faith, the faith of the 7 ecumenical councils, was preserved, but creative thinking largely departed. There took its place what we may term a theology of repetition, hanging on but not developing in an exciting or creative manner. Alongside, however, with this conservatism, Orthodox thinking during the Turkish period underwent heavy influence from the West. Under the Turks, the Greek Orthodox were not able to maintain important centres of theological teaching and study, and so young Greeks wishing to attain positions of importance in the church went westward to receive their higher education. They went to Venice in particular, to the University of Padua, some went to Rome, others went to Protestant centres like Heidelberg. And so the Orthodox of the Turkish period received their higher education usually from either Latin, Roman Catholic sources or from Protestant sources, most commonly German. Though some Greeks even came to my own country, England, to my own city, Oxford. There was certainly a Greek called Nathaniel Canopios, who was here in Oxford in the early 17th century, and he is reputed to have introduced coffee drinking to this land. Never before and never since has the Orthodox Church had such a direct influence on the daily life of the English people. Now, the result of this was that while most of these Greeks who studied in the West remained faithful to Orthodoxy, they did not convert to Roman Catholicism or to Protestantism, yet their thinking was influenced by the teaching they received from Catholic or Protestant sources. And so we have in the 17th century two tendencies: those Orthodox who are Protestantizing and those who are Catholicizing, Romanizing. The two most distinguished figures in 17th century Orthodoxy represent these opposite tendencies. In the early 17th century, there was Patriarch Cyril Lucaris, who had studied in the West, and he was strongly Calvinist in his views, and was indeed, after his death, condemned by a series of local Orthodox councils. And then on the other side, in the late 17th century, there was Patriarch Dositheos of Jerusalem, who had not in fact studied in the West, but he was strongly Catholicizing in his theology. The high point of Catholic influence on Orthodox theology comes in first 1642, when a confession of faith, an Orthodox catechism, drawn up by the Metropolitan of Kiev, Peter Mogila, was endorsed Well, he wrote it in 1642, it was endorsed in 1643. But that is strongly Romanizing in its theology. So is a later confession of faith, a statement of belief by Patriarch Dositheos that was endorsed at the Council of Jerusalem in 1672. And in these documents of Mogila and Dositheos, you will find, for example, the Roman Catholic word transubstantiation used for the consecration in the Eucharist. You will find an understanding of the state of the departed that is virtually identical with the Latin view of purgatory. So there was a double tendency, either in a Protestant or a Catholic direction in the 17th century. A number of documents were put out by the Orthodox Church, not very brilliant, but attempting to come to terms with issues raised by the Reformation. What is the Church? This had not been much debated in the period of the ecumenical councils, because there was one church, and they didn't need to think or speak consciously of the nature and authority of the church. In the 17th century, confronted by incursions from Roman Catholic and Protestant missionaries, the Orthodox had to think more clearly. What is the nature of the church? What are its characteristics? What is its authority? And this is surely very important, because in the 20th century, with the ecumenical movement, the Orthodox have again been stimulated to reflect on the nature of the Church. So it wasn't all bad news during the Ottoman period. Orthodoxy was diminished, but it survived. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in a state of grave decline. And among the different Orthodox peoples who had been subject to Ottoman rule, there arose movements for independence. In Greece, there was the rising in 1821, which led to the establishment of an independent state of Greece in 1830. Similar movements for independence occurred in Serbia, in Bulgaria, and in Moldo-Wallachia or Romania. And in this way, the Turks, during the course of the 19th century, lost nearly all their dominions in Europe. In the new states that were established as the Turkish power receded, independent autocephalous churches were also established. So the Patriarchate of Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, having expanded in the 16th century as never before, now began to diminish in size. Independent Church of Greece, Independent Church of Bulgaria, of Serbia, of Romania. The Patriarchate was unwilling to recognize the independence of these new churches, yet there was very little it could do about it, and in due course they were all recognized by the Patriarchate of Constantinople. What about the 20th century? What happened in the Orthodox world then? In the post-Ottoman period, let us say, two major events have shaped the situation of orthodoxy during the 20th century. Events that occurred at a 5-year interval. First, in 1917, there is the fall of the Russian monarchy, the Bolshevik Revolution, the coming to power of communism, and the Church of Russia, which had hitherto been the protector of the Orthodox world, the largest and most powerful of the Orthodox churches. This passed under persecution. So there is a reversal. The Orthodox who had been under Ottoman oppression gained their freedom for the most part in the 19th century, but the Church of Russia then passed under a regime far harsher than the Ottoman Turks had ever been, under Bolshevik power, under a regime that was actively and totally committed to atheism. And so particularly in the 1920s and 30s, the Church of Russia went through a dark period of extreme persecution, innumerable martyrdoms for the faith. The second event that shaped Orthodox history in the 20th century occurred in 1922, less outwardly spectacular, but nonetheless far-reaching in its effects. The Ottoman Empire more or less disintegrated during the First World War. What had been a multinational empire ruling over many different ethnic groups now disintegrated into different states. The Ottomans lost their possessions in Syria, Lebanon, in Palestine and Egypt. What had been the Ottoman Empire was reduced to Turkey. And at this moment of weakness in the Turkish side, the Greeks saw their opportunity. They thought that the western coast of Turkey, of Asia Minor, where there was a large Greek population, could be liberated from Turkish rule, could be united with Greece. And so they undertook, with the encouragement of Britain and of France, they undertook an invasion of Asia Minor, 1921 to 22. This actually proved disastrous. The result was that the Greeks were driven back by the Turks, and there followed, in 1922 to 23, an exchange of populations. All Muslims living on Greek territory in Greece were deemed to be Turks, though they had been living for many centuries where they were, and they were expelled to Turkey. Many of them didn't speak Turkish at all. And the reverse happened with any Christians who were living in Turkey, in Asia Minor. About 1.5 million of the Christians in Asia Minor And many of them were not Greek-speaking, but only spoke Turkish, and they'd been there for centuries, not to say more than a millennium. They had never had any other home. They were all summarily expelled to Greece. Greece had to face the task of absorbing 1.5 million refugees, when the population of the country, I suppose, was not more than about 5 million. You can imagine what a burden that imposed on the economic situation of the Greek people. Ethnic cleansing, as we would call it today. In this way, the ecumenical patriarchate lost nearly all its flock in Turkey. The Greeks in Constantinople were exempted from the exchange of population. They were allowed to remain in the city, to the number perhaps of several 100,000. But in the later decades of the 20th century, most of the Greek Christians in Constantinople were obliged to leave, or else they fled voluntarily. They were under considerable pressure. And so today the flock of the ecumenical throne in Constantinople itself is only about 2,000 to 4,000. There may be quite a number of Greeks who are temporarily working in Constantinople, but the permanent Greek community is a pale shadow of the glories of the great Byzantine Empire. Nevertheless, despite pressure, the Patriarch of Constantinople has remained in the city. He has insisted that he will not desert his flock. At various points in the 20th century, there was a real threat that the Turks might expel the Patriarch, but that has not in fact happened. He remains in his place. He has responsibility pastorally for certain areas in Greece, for Crete and the Dodecanese. He also has the responsibility of pastoral care for the Orthodox living, Greek Orthodox in the West, and they amount to millions. So he hasn't altogether lost his flock, and he still retains his honorary position. But often the Church of Russia makes threatening noises, saying, "We are the largest Orthodox Church. We should have leadership in the Orthodox world. The Byzantine Empire has disappeared forever." What is the meaning of the ecumenical patriarchate? But on the official level, the Russian Church would continue to honor Constantinople in the first place. Now the Russian Church, glory be to God, has emerged from persecution. During the Second World War, direct persecution was stopped, and during the later Soviet period, the Church enjoyed considerable toleration. Many of the churches that had been forcibly closed were reopened. So were some of the monasteries. There was a further bout of persecution from 1959 to 1963 in Russia. But with the fall of communism, 1988 to 89, the Russian Church has enjoyed a huge revival. Perhaps in 1988 there were about 7,000 parishes in Russia and Ukraine put together. Today there are about 30,000 parishes under the Moscow Patriarchate, and perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 parishes in Ukraine that are not under Moscow but under independent Orthodox jurisdiction. In 1988, in Russia and Ukraine put together, there were no more than 18 monasteries for men and women. Now there are more than 700. So there has been a great revival in Russia. There has not been a revival on the same scale in the lesser Orthodox churches, but in Romania in particular, the Orthodox Church remains very strong. In Greece, it has to confront the forces of secularism, but the great majority of the Greek people today continue to regard themselves as Orthodox, even if they don't go to church every Sunday. So the 20th century has been a time of upheaval for Orthodoxy, a time of oppression in the communist world from 1918 in Russia itself, from 1945 in the countries that passed under communist rule at that time, the churches of Serbia, Bulgaria and Romania. Now they are free once more. Let us see how well Orthodoxy will be able to resist the wave of secularism that is spreading in Eastern Europe and is not limited to the West. Perhaps the forces of secularism, outwardly tolerant of religion, but inwardly unsympathetic towards it, will have a more corrosive effect than direct persecution. Let us see. We Orthodox, like Christians in the West, face many challenges, but we do not forget the promise of Christ that the gates of hell will not prevail against the Church.